Check the pasta sauce shelf in almost any American grocery store, and you'll see the words San Marzano printed on can after can, jar after jar, usually alongside a red, white, and green color scheme designed to signal authentic Italian heritage. Here's the uncomfortable fact behind that label. Multiple independent investigations, including testing done by professional culinary publications, have found that the overwhelming majority of San Marzano labeled tomato products sold in the United States are not genuine, certified San Marzano tomatoes at all. In the European Union, using that name without meeting a strict, legally enforced set of requirements isn't just misleading marketing. It's food fraud, prosecutable under Italian and EU law. In the United States, it's almost entirely unregulated. Same three words on a label, two completely different legal realities, and this video is about exactly why that gap exists and how to actually tell the difference the next time you're standing in front of that shelf. Let's start with what San Marzano is actually supposed to mean, because it's a lot more specific than most shoppers realize. San Marzano is a designation of origin protected under EU law since 1996 that applies to tomatoes grown in a very specific, narrow agricultural zone in the Campania region of southern Italy, an area centered on the Sarno River Valley, including the town the tomato is named after, San Marzano sul Sarno, along with several neighboring towns. The zone's soil is volcanic, enriched over centuries by eruptions from Mount Vesuvius, which nearby growers and agricultural researchers have long credited with giving the tomatoes grown there their specific balance of sweetness, low acidity, and dense, less watery flesh compared to tomatoes grown elsewhere, even from genetically identical seed stock. The full legal designation is DOP, Denominazione di Origine Protetta, Protected Designation of Origin, the same category of EU legal protection that governs Parmigiano Reggiano cheese, genuine champagne, and a long list of other regionally specific European foods. To legally carry the San Marzano DOP label, a tomato has to be grown within that specific certified zone, cultivated according to a defined set of agricultural practices set by an official regulatory body, harvested and canned within a tightly controlled time frame. Canning within roughly 24 hours of harvest is one of the standard requirements, and processed with no additives beyond basil and salt, no citric acid, no calcium chloride, and none of the acidifying or firming agents commonly used in mass-market canned tomato production. The entire process is overseen by an official consortium, the Consorzio di Tutela del Pomodoro San Marzano dell'Agro Sarnese Nocerino DOP, which inspects farms, certifies compliance, and assigns each authentic can a numbered consortium seal that's supposed to be traceable back to a specific batch and grower. It's worth dwelling on how specific this legal framework actually gets, because it's easy to assume protected designation is a vague marketing adjacent label when in fact it functions closer to a detailed agricultural rulebook. The consortium specifications don't just cover where the tomatoes are grown, they cover plant density per hectare, permitted irrigation methods, the specific staking and pruning techniques used to support the plants, and even restrictions on how the tomatoes are transported from field to cannery, since bruising or excessive handling time can affect the flesh texture the designation is specifically meant to preserve. Every stage of that process is subject to inspection, and a grower operating within the geographically correct zone can still lose certification for that season's crop if they deviate from the approved cultivation method, which is a meaningfully higher bar than simply proving the tomatoes came from the right patch of ground. That's an enormous amount of regulatory infrastructure sitting behind three words on a label. And here's the part that makes the United States market such a strange case. Almost none of that infrastructure has any legal force once the product, or more often just the name, crosses the Atlantic. It's also worth understanding just how difficult this kind of fraud actually is to catch from a shopper's side, which is part of why it's persisted for as long as it has. Canned tomatoes are a genuinely hard product category for a consumer to visually or even chemically evaluate at the point of sale. Unlike, for example, a wine vintage or a cheese's rind, there's no easy sensory tell that immediately distinguishes a genuine protected designation of origin tomato from a well-grown imitation once both are processed, canned, and sitting on a shelf under a label making the same visual claim. That's precisely why the European Union built an inspection and certification system rather than relying on consumers or even retailers to sort it out after the fact. The fraud is specifically designed to be invisible at the point of purchase, which makes upstream verification, not shopper vigilance, the actual mechanism doing the protective work in the European Union market. In the United States, without that upstream verification layer, the entire burden shifts onto the individual shopper reading fine print, which is a genuinely unequal fight against a label deliberately designed to imply more than it's legally required to prove. Independent testing has repeatedly found that the vast majority of canned tomatoes sold in the United States under the San Marzano name don't carry genuine protected designation of origin certification, don't show the consortium seal, and in a meaningful share of cases aren't even the San Marzano tomato variety at all. Some testing has identified ordinary plum tomatoes grown nowhere near the protected zone, simply packaged with San Marzano printed prominently on the label as what amounts to a style descriptor rather than a truthful claim of origin. This isn't a fringe problem limited to obscure store brands either. Investigations over the years have flagged well-known, widely distributed products carrying the name without the certification to back it up. So why does this work in the United States when it wouldn't work in Italy? The answer comes down to a genuine structural gap in how the two legal systems treat geographic food names. The EU operates what's called a sui generis system for protected geographical indications, a body of law built specifically for this purpose, treating a name like San Marzano the same way trademark law treats a brand name, but tied to a place and a production method instead of a company. Using the name without meeting the certified requirements is a straightforward legal violation actively enforced in Italy by dedicated food fraud units, including a specialized branch of the Carabinieri that investigates agricultural and food fraud specifically, alongside Italy's broader food quality and anti-fraud inspectorate. The United States has no equivalent legal category. U.S. trademark law is built around protecting brand names tied to a specific company, not place names tied to a growing region and shared among many producers within that region. There is a narrower U.S. mechanism called a certification mark, administered through the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, which can offer some legal protection to a geographic food name. Idaho potatoes are a well-known example of a legally protected certification mark in the US, but it's an opt-in system that a specific producer group has to actively apply for and defend, and it doesn't automatically extend to foreign protected designations just because the EU recognizes them. In practice, US law has generally treated San Marzano as a varietal name, essentially describing a type of tomato rather than a protected place of origin, which means the seeds themselves can legally be grown anywhere in the world, including California and other parts of Italy well outside the certified zone, and still be sold under that name in the US without violating any federal law. This isn't a one-off case either. It's part of a much larger ongoing trade friction point between the US and the EU over geographical indications generally. The EU has spent years pushing through trade negotiations for broader international recognition of protected food names. The same underlying dispute shows up with Parmesan versus genuine Parmigiano Reggiano, with feta cheese, which is itself a protected EU designation tied specifically to Greece, and with champagne versus sparkling wine made using the same method elsewhere. The US has generally resisted broad, automatic recognition of these EU designations, partly because American producers, some with decades of established use of these generic-sounding names, would face real financial and legal disruption if the US suddenly adopted the EU system wholesale. San Marzano tomatoes are really just one specific, well-documented example of a much bigger and still unresolved transatlantic legal disagreement about who gets to own a place name attached to food. It's worth understanding why the US has held this position so consistently across multiple rounds of trade negotiation, because it's not simply protectionism for its own sake. A significant number of American food producers, some Italian-American family businesses going back multiple generations, built entire product lines and regional reputations around names like Parmesan, Asiago, or Feta, long before any EU trade delegation raised the issue, operating in good faith under US law the entire time. Wholesale adoption of the EU's protected name system would, in many of these cases, require those established American producers to rename products that have carried the same name in the same US market for the better part of a century, an outcome U.S. trade negotiators have consistently argued is neither fair to those producers nor something American consumers are genuinely confused by, since generic use of a term like Parmesan has arguably taken on its own independent meaning in American English over that much time, separate from a strict claim about Italian geographic origin. The EU's counter-argument is that this generic drift is exactly the erosion its protected name system was built to prevent in the first place, and that allowing it to continue anywhere simply normalizes the same pattern spreading further. Neither side has fully won this argument, which is part of why it keeps resurfacing in trade talks rather than getting permanently resolved. Before we get to the practical part of this, it's worth being fair to the other side of this story, because not every non-DOP San Marzano product on a US shelf is trying to deceive anyone. San Marzano variety seeds, grown honestly and skillfully in California or elsewhere, using genuine San Marzano cultivar stock, can produce a genuinely excellent tomato, just not one that is legally entitled to Italy's protected designation, because the DOP, protected designation of origin, is tied to that specific volcanic soil growing region, not to the genetic variety of the seed alone. Some California growers producing San Marzano variety tomatoes have specifically built reputations around high-quality, honestly labeled product competing on genuine flavor and growing practice rather than borrowed geographic prestige, and a handful of small-batch American producers have gone further, publishing their own soil composition and cultivation data specifically to make the case that their non-DOP tomatoes deserve consideration on their own merits, independent of the Italian designation entirely. A product honestly labeled as San Marzano style or San Marzano variety grown in California is not committing fraud under either US or EU law. It is simply not making the stronger, more specific claim of protected Italian origin. And that distinction, subtle as it sounds, is exactly the gap that less scrupulous producers exploit by printing San Marzano alone, without any of those qualifying words, and letting the shopper assume the stronger claim on their own. So practically, here's how to actually tell the difference standing in front of that shelf. First, look for the DOP seal itself, a specific numbered consortium certification mark printed on the can, along with the full official designation, Pomodoro San Marzano dell'Agro Sarnese Nocerino DOP. If that seal and that specific language aren't on the can, you're not looking at a certified product, regardless of how prominently San Marzano appears elsewhere on the label. Second, check the ingredient list. Genuine DOP. San Marzano tomatoes are canned with only tomatoes, tomato juice, and in some cases, basil and salt, nothing else. If you see citric acid or calcium chloride listed, both extremely common in mass market canned tomato production as acidifying and firming agents, you're looking at a product that doesn't meet DOP processing rules, whatever the front label claims. Citric acid in particular is worth understanding why it is there at all. It is added primarily to standardize acidity for shelf stability and food safety in large-scale commercial canning, a legitimate manufacturing consideration for producers not operating under the DOP's tighter harvest-to-can timeline, but its presence is also one of the most reliable single tells that a can was not produced under the consortium's specific rules, since genuine DOP production relies on the tomato's own natural acidity and the speed of processing rather than any added acidifying agent to achieve the same stability. Third, check the country and importer information, usually printed in small text near the bottom of the label. Genuine DOP San Marzano tomatoes are grown and canned in that specific region of Italy and imported as a finished product. If the can does not specify Italian origin at all, or names a US packing location, the tomatoes inside did not come from the protected zone, whatever the front of the label implies. And for what it is worth, there are legitimately certified DOP options available in US grocery stores if you know what to look for. Certain imported brands do carry the real designation and the consortium seal, sitting right next to a dozen other cans making the same visual claim without any of the certification behind it. The label alone will not tell you which is which. The seal, the ingredient list, and the country of origin will. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including EU-protected designation of origin registries, Consortio di Tutela del Pomodoro San Marzano documentation, and USPTO certification mark records. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Regulations and certification standards change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're heading somewhere almost nobody expects a regulatory comparison video to go: McDonald's French fries, and the country-by-country ingredient differences hiding in one of the most identical-looking products on Earth. Subscribe if you want to see exactly what's different in the fryer.